Hello everyone, welcome to CEC lecture. The topic of analysis is colonialism and colonization. In this lecture, we shall discuss the meaning of the concept of colonialism. We shall discuss types of colonialism and most important, the focus of the lecture shall be on understanding causes of colonialism. This lecture shall also discuss the difference between two very important concepts, that is colonialism and imperialism. This lecture shall also attempt to discuss various perspectives pertaining to colonialism using historical, literary and important political texts. As we begin the study with reference to understanding colonialism and the process of colonization with a special focus towards the causes, the first question that comes across is, what do we mean by colonialism? Colonialism implies domination of a people or area by a foreign state or nation. Now this definition we got by online search. Further, as we explored, colonialism has been defined as the practice of domination, and this domination involves subjugation of one people to another. As we discuss the concept of colonialism, it is important to understand that this concept is closely linked with the concept of imperialism. Now, as we discuss colonialism and imperialism, which have very important bearing on the discipline of modern world history, study of international relations, political science, political theory, amongst others, we know that both colonialism and imperialism, though being closely linked to each other, had a common similarity that they were forms of conquest. Conquest is an important feature which is the defining similarity between colonialism and imperialism. However, we must understand that the two terms are different. What do we mean by imperialism? Imperialism is the practice of extending the power, control or rule by a country over the political and economic life of the areas outside its own borders. Therefore, therein lies the difference. Imperialism is the control or influence that is exercised either formally or informally, directly or indirectly, politically or economically. Whereas colonialism, it is formal political control, which involves territorial annexation and loss of sovereignty. Now, as we discuss colonialism, we must understand that it is not a modern construct. By modern construct, we imply that it is not peculiar to the modern world history only. Because when we reflect towards ancient historical times, namely ancient Greeks, they set up colonies, so did the Romans. Further, when we study the early Assyrian empires, the Roman empires, there are examples of colonialism, and quite often historians interpret them as examples of earlier colonialism. Now, when we reflect towards 16th century, no doubt during this time framework, there was in scale reach of colonialism. Now, this brings us to the next important aspect, that is, what are the various types of colonialism then? Settler colonialism involves emigration at large scale as an outcome of economic or political issues. As we talk about colonialism, settler colonialism aims largely to replace an existing population. Historians, anthropologists have given examples of Australia, Canada, United States with reference to understanding settler colonialism. Further, as we are discussing types of colonialism, exploitation colonialism involves trade and commerce like the export of goods or even the slave trade. Surrogate colonialism, another important type of colonialism. Surrogate colonialism, it is the settlement project supported by a colonial power in which most of the settlers do not come from the same ethnic group as the ruling power. Internal colonialism, it is a concept of unequal structural power between areas of a state, whereas trade colonialism, it focuses on the control over trading relationship of the colony. Now, as we discuss various causes that were responsible for colonialism, it is very essential to understand that we focus towards the issues in the 16th and the 17th century. Now, when we define and understand 16th and 17th century, an important phenomena that had a huge impact not only on the world history but also with reference to construction of relations between nation states, it was the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution is one of the important causes for the rise of colonialism in modern world history. Industrial Revolution provided funding for wealthier European nations to expand their territories. With the rise of new industries, new factories came up, and there was a demand for raw material, cheap labor. This propelled the wealthier nations to go forward in the search for places with raw materials, new market, cheap labor that were needed for doing the business. So Industrial Revolution, with the change in the format of doing the work, with the rise of new factory-based industrial models, led to European nations move towards new land to ensure the security and needs of their rising industrial sector. Another important cause, as we are discussing various causes responsible for rise of colonialism related to Industrial Revolution, it is the mercantilism. How do we define mercantilism? Mercantilism is an economic practice, and this economic practice is used by governments wherein they try to use their economies to augment state power at the expense of other countries. Mercantilism is a very important aspect with reference to understanding economic nationalism in the domain of international political economy even today. When we talk about mercantilism with reference to colonialism, its main assumptions were that is nations' wealth and power are best served by increasing exports, increasing trade. And this in turn led to adoption of restrictive trade practices and policies. Further, with the idea that trade should be regulated with other nations, this is often termed as protectionism. And even today, in the contemporary international relations and global governance scenario, protectionism with reference to tariffs, with reference to trade agreements, is an important concept. The policy of mercantilism, as we understand with reference to colonialism, was based on the premise that the economic development of the mother country, that is, metropolis, was most important. And in this framework, colonies should be governed or controlled in such a way that they lead to advantage and profit of the metropolis. As we are understanding various causes for colonialism with industrial revolution and mercantilism, the issue of European rivalry also demands attention, because earlier it was only Spain and Portugal that were moving forward with forays and into new lands. However, later one observes, and there are historical records to substantiate it, that earlier it was Spain and Portugal, later France and England also entered the race. And in this scenario, acquiring new colonies became a matter relating to national pride. And therein European rivalry led to what can be called as competitive colonialism. Further, with all these processes, one cannot ignore that how developments in transport and mechanisms of communication led to rise of colonialism further. Herein, one must mention developments in navigation, sailing ships, steamships carrying goods much faster. And herein, with all these developments, wherein there are historical records to prove that how the colonial powers, the imperialist countries, they built railroads, infrastructure, inland waterways, and with all these construction of railroads, infrastructure and inland waterways, the attempt was to ensure that the colonial land, the colony works better for the advantage of the metropolis. So herein what we see that the world history was on a different trajectory. And herein in this trajectory, colonialism was like nationalism. It developed into a mass cult. That is how the very idea that this acquiring colonies was related to economic development of the European power. Acquiring colonies became a symbol of national pride. As we are discussing causes of colonialism, one must also look at how discovery of new lands and trade routes was felicitated with all the adjoining factors, namely the rise of industrial revolution, mercantilism, developments in transport and communications, and therein the economic consideration, that is using the colonies for economic benefits, was a very important aspect. Now, colonialism as a process has merits also. That is, when we understand from the point of view of the colonial powers gave the argument that colonialism or their venturing out or foray towards the foreign land was somewhere beneficial for the colony, namely establishment of infrastructure, development of new cultural values, and for the colonial powers, as being discussed, it led to the industrial growth, and colonialism was linked to the prestige of the countries. Now, as we understand colonialism, one must understand that there have been various narratives to critique it as well as to support it. Herein, we discuss the Enlightenment anti-imperialist thinker Denis Diderot, and Denis Diderot, the French philosopher, in his very important work, and we read it through an edited work, A History of the Two Indies. Denis Diderot questions a very important thing, that is, as the word is in French, we try to quote, "Ce pays est à nous." The country is yours. That is, this country is yours. And why? Because you have entered it. This country belongs to the inhabitants of Tahiti. What would you think? Quoting Denis Diderot, the French philosopher, from the History of the Two Indies. So herein we find that there is a critique of the colonial practice. In the same light, as we reflect on the very important political text, that is, Considerations on Representative Government, 1861, John Stuart Mill states a very important aspect, that why foreign people are not suited to governing the colonies. And from a governance point of view, John Stuart Mill presents a very important argument, that is absence of knowledge of local conditions, which is very important for governing. And as we understand colonialism, we must understand that colonization was needed with all the investments, with all the infrastructure built up by the foreign powers. It was essential to control the political processes, to control the governance mechanisms as well. Alexis Charles Tocqueville, the French political scientist, political philosopher, and historian, in his work Essay on Algeria, supports a different argument. That is, he is arguing in favor of expanding the French presence in Algeria. Quoting from Alexis de Tocqueville's second letter on Algeria, the important line, and we quote, "I have no doubt that we can raise on the coast of Africa a great moment to the glory of our country." So herein we find a perspective that supported the practice of colonialism. Lenin, in his work Imperialism, Stage of Capitalism, in the year 1917, gave an alternative explanation as well as a critique with reference to colonialism and imperialism. Lenin points out, and we quote, that as per him, imperialism was a technique which allowed European countries to put off the inevitable domestic revolutionary crisis by exporting their own economic burdens onto the weaker states. So therefore one finds that colonialism as a process has multiple interpretations. There are supporters of the process as well as there are important critiques too. Colonialism implies domination of a people or area by a foreign state or nation, and this practice, this control, though not a modern construct, but towards the 16th century, there was increase in its scale and reach of operations. One finds that with industrial revolution, mercantilism, new forms of rivalry, colonialism being linked to nationalism, all of it gave a lot of impetus for colonialism to rise in the modern world history, European history, and all of it had a huge impact on the contemporary international relations, on modern world history also. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture on colonialism and colonization presented you significant inputs with reference to understanding the concept, the causes responsible for it, and understanding the important debates pertaining to imperialism, industrial revolution, mercantilism, amongst others. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all for the lecture. Thank you very much.